Hi, everybody, and again, welcome to our 2020 annual Senior Parent Night. We are so excited to see you, and thank you for joining in on my FAFSA session. I am going to go ahead and present my screen so you guys can follow along with the presentation as we're going to be talking about the FAFSA. So again, we are going to be talking about filing the FAFSA. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and it is utilized by the federal government to determine financial aid eligibility. So again, it is used to essentially say whether you can receive financial aid from the federal government and what types of aid you can receive from them, whether that be um, grants and or loans. The big determining factor there being financial need or demonstrated need, which we'll talk about a bit later in the presentation. Um, just to note that FAFSA will be available on October 1st and is available on October 1st of every year. Um, so you want to definitely get that filled out as soon as possible. The sooner the better, just in relation to kind of maximizing the amount of financial aid you are going to be eligible for. So why should you fill out the FAFSA? Well, again, the FAFSA is kind of the foundation for financial aid. Um, it will make several forms of aid available to students. One of those forms being grants, which is free money. Um, Also, colleges and universities typically require it to be considered for institutional aid. So, if you want to be considered for scholarships and grants from the university that you'll be attending, you will need to fill out the FAFSA in most cases. The one other thing being that it can open up doors to you to outside scholarships for students who demonstrate. Significant financial need. Some scholarships will take that into consideration um, as they are kind of vetting out applicants. So these are all a lot of the reasons why you should fill out the FAFSA. Um, it is essentially the starting point for financial aid. So, how do you fill out the FAFSA? I'm going to kind of delineate the next 7 steps. I'm not going to go into too much detail on them now because we will be covering them throughout the entirety of the presentation. But I just kind of wanted to kind of give you guys a idea of a layout of what this process looks like. So, the first step is to create your federal student aid ID, your FSA ID, which is essentially your identifier for when you're utilizing the FAFSA. It's attached to your demographic information, i.e., your social security number, your legal name, and your date of birth. So that is the first thing. That's the kind of the first step that you take in completing this process is actually making those accounts. And you will need to make an account for both the one parent as well as the student. The second step is going to be to collect all necessary documentation and demographic information. We'll kind of touch base into what all of these materials are going to encompass later. The third step is to access the application via FAFSA.ed.gov, and that is FAFSA.ed.gov. It's essential to utilize this URL and this URL only. This is the only place where you can file the FAFSA. Any other URL would be a scam URL. You should never have to present money or present credit card information or anything of the likes in order to fill out this application. The fourth step is the kind of the bulkiest portion of the bulkiest step. It is the actual process of filling out information within the FAFSA. And this is going to include your student demographic information, the school selections for the student, dependency information, parent demographics, and financial information as well. Again, we will touch on this more in depth later in the presentation. The fifth step is to kind of finalize the FAFSA, to sign it and submit it using your federal student aid ID. It is an electronic signature. The sixth step is to review your student aid report. This is kind of a synopsis of your FAFSA application. It will also kind of tell you what your EFC is and kind of note what what forms of federal aid you'll be available for. And we'll kind of touch on EFC and the different forms of aid a little later. And the seventh step is going to be to check your emails consistently, as well as your snail mail to just make sure that any documents that are being asked for or required are you're able to present those to the university. Some students will be selected for what we call verification, and will need to present their universities and colleges with verifying information um, to ensure that the information they presented to FAFSA is correct. So, just to kind of go a bit more in depth on creating your federal student aid ID, um, the FSA ID again is an identifier for both students and parents. And again, both the student and at least one parent will need to create an ID. This ID will be utilized every time you kind of log in to create the FAFSA. And the kind of special thing about the FSA ID is that you can only create one ever, like ever. The FSA ID is attached to your social and your birthday and your name. So you literally, upon attempting to create a secondary account, would not be permitted to. So it's going to be very important that you are storing your login information somewhere that in in consecutive years you will be able to again fill out the FAFSA. So the steps for creating your FSAID is going to be to access fsaid.gov. This is the website where you'll be able to click on create an FSAID and then enter in your personal information. It's going to be extremely important to make sure that you enter in this information accurately. And I will be reiterating this several times throughout the presentation. When you are kind of dealing with this application, entering in information inaccurately can cause you lots of grief, meaning your application can bounce back. You might have issues creating, filling out the FAFSA because of the information not syncing. If you put it correctly on your FAFSA, but it's incorrect on your FSID, then it won't link. The account won't link to your application. It can cause you lots of it can just create this kind of barrier for you in completing this process. And I will say, um, utilizing helplines for FAFSA can be helpful, but it can be a tedious process because they do have lengthy lines. So making sure that you are entering everything in accurately on the front ends will definitely make this process a lot simpler and a lot easier for you. As you are filling out the application, make sure to use a reliable email and phone number. It will ensure that you're able to get correspondence from FAFSA and FSA if they need to contact you. The other big thing is if you do lose your username or if you lose your password, having email addresses and phone numbers that you are constantly able to access will ensure that you are able um, to reset your password or well, not your username, but reset your password and access your username if need be. Um, the fifth step is to kind of select and answer 4 challenge questions. The first 2 questions will be pre-selected. The second 2 you will actually have to generate, so come up with your own questions and own answers to those questions. I'll say be very cautious when selecting your questions. You want to make sure that your questions aren't questions that are going to age, meaning they're not going to be questions where the answers change over time. And so, a lot of folks like to use the "What's my favorite color?" Um, I know lots of folks will actually kind of change their favorite color over a period of time. So, it might be blue this year, and in 4 years, it may be green. So that can kind of create some issues when you're trying to gain re-entry into an account if you don't select proper challenge questions. Another big thing is that um, as you're doing this, be cautious of of using like plural words. So one of the questions typically is, what's your high school mascot? If you were to put in rockets with an S, if you tried to answer the question after trying to like after the fact, and you put in rockets with no S, it would not register that as being the correct answer. So after selecting your questions and choosing your answers, I also suggest that you store these somewhere. The sixth step is verifying your email address and phone number. You will be receiving PIN numbers to kind of to enter into the FSA ID website to verify those email addresses and phone numbers. And then the seventh step is to store your username and password. It is so important that you do not lose this information. Again, you will use it for this year and every year that you attend an institution of higher learning and seek to obtain financial aid. So again, it is super important that you have this password. I will say for a lot of our parents, they some of them will have FSA IDs already. Some of them will have them and not necessarily remember that they have them or won't remember creating one. This sometimes can be the case for parents who have had students recently who've attended universities or colleges. But this can also be the case for parents who have recently and sometimes not so recently attended colleges and universities for themselves. So if you kind of follow the steps above and you have a reliable email and phone number and or countless questions that you can answer fairly easily, you may be able to recover your username and password. If you are unable to do this, again, you will not be able to create a new username and password, and you will need to call the FSA ID helpline. Um, Again, this process can be a bit cumbersome just because of the lengthy wait times. I will say that doing this a little earlier on um, can be beneficial. And I say that because once we hit October, their lines are going to be essentially blown up because everyone across the country is going to be attempting to complete the FAFSA, and they're going to be creating FSA IDs. So doing that sooner rather than later will definitely make this process easier for you. So the second step before starting the FAFSA is to gather all of the pertinent information and documentation that you'll need in order to submit the FAFSA. One of these things that we just talked about is the FSA IDs, and again, you'll need FSA ID for the student and then for one parent. You'll need Social Security information, federal income statements, tax information, tax forms, your W-2s, and then even information in relation to kind of your bank statements, your liquid and your hard assets, and anything that would uh, nod to kind of your finances and your financial statuses. So step three in completing the FAFSA is to access the FAFSA website. So in order to access this website, you do want to use the URL fafsa.ed.gov. The graphic kind of will show you what the home screen of the website looks like. It is essential that you are using this particular URL. Again, there are known websites to kind of be out there that are scam websites, websites that will ask for monetary compensation for assistance with completing the FAFSA. Um, so just make sure that you are using the URL as shown. Once you're on this screen, if you are starting your FAFSA application for the first time, you will click Start here under New to the FAFSA process. Once you get started, you can save the application and come back. Upon re-entry, you would just log in as a returning user. But for today, we'll be approaching it as if we are starting for the first time. So just you would just click Start here. So, once you click start here, you will have two options when logging in. One of those options is to log in as the student. The second option is to log in as the parent or a preparer or a student from a freely associated state. it is really important to make the correct selection here. And you definitely can kind of approach this either way. It's just to ensure that if you are completing the application as a student, that you are signing in with your student's FSA ID. If the parent signs in with their FSA ID at this point, the application becomes their application and they are submitting application for financial aid for themselves. So making sure that you use the student's FSA ID at this point. It might sound a little silly that I'm kind of harping on this, but we do have situations where parents will submit FAFSAs for themselves under the impression that they submitted them for their students. If the parent wants to go in and file their FAFSA for their student, but they don't necessarily have access to their FSA ID, that you can click the option to submit as the parent. In this case, you would just have to provide the demographic information for the student, and it would take that demographic information and associate it with the student's FSA ID. The fourth step to this process is going to be filling out the actual application. And in the application screens, the first screen is going to be in regards to student demographics. Um, the first thing that the student is going to fill out is their personal information. So those it's going to be really important to make sure that those personal identifiers are correct and congruent with federal documents. So making sure that the social security numbers and the names, birthdays all match. Your birth certificate, your social security card, all of that stuff is you want to make sure that all of that information is the same. Otherwise, your applications will not sync and or will bounce back. You'll put in the student's address, um, their physical address. Um, you'll also include the student's email and phone number. For students, you want to ensure that they are using a personal email address. This will just kind of ensure that if they need to access the FAFSA after next year, and I say after next year because after this year, their student email addresses will no longer they will no longer have access to it. So that's why we kind of really encourage for them to use personal email addresses. And after that, the student will enter in their education information. In regards to the FAFSA for our students, they are all going to be first year students, regardless of whether they have taken college classes at PCC or not. And the last information is going to be their high school information. So that's just going to be them kind of selecting Person High School as their post secondary, as their secondary school. For SIP continued, the students will go in and do their school selection, so they'll be able to search the schools that they want to have their FAFSA sent to. The students can have their FAFSA sent to 10 schools. We highly encourage that if a student is thinking about a school, has applied to a school, may apply to a school, that they go ahead and submit the FAFSA to those schools. It can be a bit cumbersome to go back after submitting the FAFSA and editing it to include those schools. So submitting, any and every school that is a potential for the student beforehand can alleviate the need to kind of go through this process again. At this time, after selecting your schools, you would be kind of instructed to fill out the screens that relate to student dependency. Um, with the FAFSA, students can be considered dependent or independent. The majority of our students are considered dependent students, meaning a majority of our students are receiving care or at least 50% of um, the finances needed to kind of sustain them is being provided for them by a parent. So a majority of our students will be considered dependent. There are a few special circumstances that would result in a student being independent. If you feel like you are an independent student, if you are um, kind of fending for yourself, if you want to reach out to your counselor or college advisor, we can definitely help you in kind of navigating that. Um, the screens that are going to show for this portion of the application are going to be in relation to student marital status. So students will either be married, single, or widowed. A majority of our students will be single, regardless of whether they have boyfriends or girlfriends, or are dating, or any of the likes. So, it's really important for them to kind of be aware of what these different statuses mean. Um, the other question is going to be in relation to whether students have dependents. So the only time a student is going to be considered to have a dependent is if they have a child that they have birthed, that is biologically theirs, that they are sustaining. Um, and the last question is just going to be kind of several questions that are going to encompass some of those special circumstances. You would just kind of read through those, and if any of them apply to you, then you would kind of be able to acknowledge that at that time. Once the student has determined whether they are dependent or independent, if the student is dependent, they would then be instructed to provide parent demographic information. Would have to do so in order to be considered for aid unless a special circumstance exists. For students who are independent students, they will not need to provide parent demographic information. Um, for purposes of today, we will be talking about students who are going to be your dependent students. So we have to consider who is considered a parent for these students. So for FAFSA will only accept legal parents. So those parents who are biological parents, or who are adoptive parents, or people who have been determined by the state to be a student's parent. So those are the folks that can go on the FAFSA as a parent. This henceforth means that grandparents, siblings, family members, or even legal guardians do not and are not considered legal parents for purposes of the FAFSA. If a student that resides with someone who is not their legal parent, it would still be expected for them to use their legal parent's demographic information on the FAFSA. If the student is not able to access this information, it would be very important for them to communicate that with their university, their college or their university. Um, and um, in relation to filling out the FAFSA, they can speak with their counselor and or college advisor, and we can help in navigating making that connection. So, for students who have parents who are remarried, separated, divorced, or unmarried, you kind of come to this fork when we have to decide, are we including both parents, are we including one parent, or are we including no parents? So if a student has parents who are legally separated or divorced, um, you will list the parent that the student has lived the most with in the past year. If the student lives with both parents equally, let's say they're with one parent one week and another parent another week, they technically would be obliged to include the parent who has supported them the most financially in the last 12 months. Um, I will give you um, my non-PC answer to kind of this question, for the student kind of being able to access the most um, financial aid. It would benefit the student to include the parent who has the least amount of financial compensation. So for students who have parents who are divorced or remarried, the student would have to list the parent and step parent if they are including that particular parent as their parent. That is only in relation to legal marriage. If the parent is just dating the step parent, they will not need to include that information. If parents are unmarried but living together, so sustaining one household with with the child living there, the student would need to list both parents. When determining the parent's household size, for the short answer to this is that anyone who lives within the home and the parent provides some sort um, of who provides some sort of financial support for, that person would be considered to be a part of the parent's household, whether they be an adult or a child. So, this portion of the application where we submit financial information is the most, I'll say the most tedious part, the most anxiety producing part of the application, because it deals with lots of numbers. It deals with tax information and all of that fun stuff. Um, in regards to the FAFSA, we do use prior taxes, meaning taxes from 2 years ago. Um, and for the students who are going to be submitting an application for the 2021-2022 school year, they'll be using their tax information from the parents' tax information from 2019, from the 2019 fiscal year. So those would be the taxes that were just filled in this prior tax season. The reason why it's prior is because the student will be enrolling um, in university in 2021. However, the taxes used are from 2019, so that's 2 years prior. So we'll be determining, financial need for the year 2021, 2022 based off of the taxes from 2019. To simplify this process, the IRS has created a data retrieval tool that parents can utilize for parents who have submitted their taxes electronically. Once you get to the part of the application where you'll submit your financial information, students will be well, parents will be able to access that data retrieval tool where they would put in their FSA ID and password, and essentially link the FAFSA to the IRS for the IRS to basically pop all of that information in there. Um, it is the best practice to use the IRS data retrieval tool. It can prevent students from entering in wrong information, and you will be less likely to be selected for verification. And we'll talk about the verification process a little later. If you aren't able to access the data retrieval tool, um, you will have to enter in all of your tax information by hand, and the application tends to let you know exactly what line item from your tax return will go into the FAFSA. When you get to this part of the application, it is imperative that you do not guess. You do not want for your application to get flagged for being incorrect. Um, and lastly, if you did not file your tax returns and were required to, meaning you were expected to file by the federal government, by the state, and you did not, you will have to file your taxes, even if, even with us being like a year out, in order for your students to be eligible for financial aid. There's really no way around it. And if you have questions in regards to, kind of how to start that process, you can definitely reach out to one of the counselors or the college advisor. So, after everything that's kind of um, a part of step 4, we get to step 5, which is fairly simple. It's actually just signing the FAFSA. And when we get to this portion of the application, all you have to do is enter in your FSA ID. So your username, your password, and you would just click sign this FAFSA, and that is that. The parent will do that as well as the student. Step 6 is going to be the portion of the application where you review your student aid report. Your student aid report, your SAR as it is called often, is basically a synopsis of the things that you entered in the application. One of the things that is showcased here is the expected family contribution, your EFC. Um, and your EFC is essentially the amount of money the government expects for your family to be able to pay for you to attend college or university. We'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. But this report will also list, the potential government aid that you'll be able to access as well. So when you're reviewing your SAR, again, your expected family contribution will be on there. And your EFC, as we call it, is utilized to determine the demonstrated need that you have for any particular institution. So your EFC can range just depending on kind of how much money your household has in comparison to the number of members that are part of your household. Um, if your family is more affluent, more wealthy, you'll have a higher EFC as opposed to someone who may be socioeconomically disadvantaged. We will have cases where EFCs are as low as zero. And then sometimes we'll have EFCs that are high or as high as like $60,000. So uh, families being um, families being thought to be, in a place where they're able to contribute $60,000 per year to their students' education. So essentially, what happens is colleges will take their cost of attendance. So I use $25,000 because that's roughly what 1 year of attendance at UNC, the total cost of attendance, including housing, room, board, food, the whole 9 yards cost. It's roughly 25,000. If a family's EFC was $5,000, so they are expected to pay $5,000. Basically, what that would leave us with is $20,000. So $20,000 that the government would expect the family not to be able to pay. So that is going to be what we call demonstrated need. So demonstrated need is going to definitely play a factor into um, determining whether students are eligible for need-based aid and things of the likes. So we wanted to cover the types of federal aid that you might see on your student aid report. So one of those things is the Pell Grant, which can be upwards of over $6,000 a year based off of financial needs. So for our students who have lower EFCs, they are eligible for the Pell Grant, which is free money. Um, our our students who have lower EFCs are also eligible for subsidized loans, which are low interest loans that do not incur interest or require repayment. So they don't incur any interest, and you don't have to make any payments on the loan while you are in school. 6 months after you have ceased going to school, that is when the loan will start to incur interest as well as require repayment. All students will be eligible to access unsubsidized loans. These are low interest loans. However, they do accrue interest from the moment they are dispersed. So as soon as your university kind of gets that money, they are expected to, the interest starts to occur. However, students are not required to repay this until 6 months after they disenroll. The last type of the federal aid is going to be federal work study. And this is money that the federal government will give to your universities to essentially pay you to work on campus. So a lot of times students will be able to access jobs on campus, in different offices or working for different programs that will allow for them to, get really great work experience while also, earning money to kind of help fund their educations. And the last step of the whole FAFSA process is going to be kind of waiting to hear back from the schools that you selected. In the FAFSA, students will expect to receive financial aid award letters in the spring semester, usually in March. sometimes as early as February and as late as April. Um, but kind of as this process commences, we will also have students who are selected for verification. FAFSA selects between 25 and 33% of students for the verification process. These students are selected at random, and they are selected to essentially submit documents to verify that what they put on the FAFSA was actually accurate. For students who are selected for verification, they will receive information directly from their colleges and universities requesting said documentation. To kind of reiterate the IRS data retrieval tool, students who utilize the IRS data retrieval tool are less likely to be selected for verification. So this is the last step of the process, and it concludes my segment of Parent Senior Night. Um, if you have questions, make sure to reach out to your counselor as well as your college advisor, and we do hope that you have enjoyed. All right, bye bye.